Good evening from Paris. My name is Isabel Rock, and I'm the head of research and scientific coordination at the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies. I warmly welcome you to this unprecedented joint webinar organized by the Arab Center Washington and our center in Paris on the very critical topic, 1 year into the war on Gaza, how have EU and US foreign policies evolved? This is the first time that both of our centers have come together to host such an event. The decision to collaborate on this webinar stems from the gravity of the current political climate, both in Europe and the United States. The severity of the situation, particularly in the Middle East, has underscored the need for us to combine our perspectives in order to break free from conventional narratives. Now more than ever, as the geopolitical landscape undergoes significant shifts, it is crucial to engage in a more nuanced and multifaceted analysis. Over the past year, the ongoing conflict in Gaza has not only reshaped the region, but has also posed challenges for international actors, compelling them to reconsider and in some cases redefine their foreign policies. The European Union and the United States, while often aligned, have faced distinct domestic and international pressures, leading to both subtle and profound changes in their diplomatic approaches to the Gaza war. Today, we will explore how these foreign policy dynamics have evolved, the impact they have had on the ground, and the role they play in shaping the future of peace and security in the Middle East. We are honored to have a distinguished panel of experts with us who will provide deep insights into these pressing issues. We encourage you to engage actively, share your thoughts, ask questions, and contribute to what we hope will be a thought-provoking and enriching conversation. With that, I will now turn over to our moderator, Khalil Jashan, who will introduce our panel speakers and guide us through today's discussion. I thank you for joining us today, and I hope you will find this webinar both insightful and valuable.
Thank you, Isabel, for your introduction of the subject matter. And on behalf of Arab Center Washington, D.C., I'd like to also welcome everybody and welcome this opportunity, the first of its kind, as Isabel said, a webinar in partnership with our colleagues at CAREB in Paris. Let me begin, first of all, by talking about the format, which is slightly different than you might have been accustomed to. Today, most of the program is going to be in the format of a conversation. So there will be no necessarily individual presentations, but what we'll have is 3 clusters of questions that I will address to each one of our distinguished speakers, participants. And then we will use the balance of our time, I would say about 30 minutes at the end of the program for Q&A to receive your questions. And you can use the Q&A button at the bottom of your page, if you will, anytime during the program to send your questions. And feel free to mention your name. If you are addressing your question to a particular participant, please indicate that and be brief so we can entertain as many of them as possible. Let me go ahead now, before we start the conversation, introduce our distinguished speakers. I will do it alphabetically. The first is Karim Emil Bitar, who's Professor of International Relations and former director of the Institute of Political Science at Saint Joseph University of Beirut. Welcome, Karim, and thank you for joining us today. Next is Diana Bhutto, Palestinian-Canadian lawyer, media commentator, political activist. Diana is a former spokesperson for the PLO and legal advisor to the Palestinian delegation during peace negotiations in the 1990s. Chaz Freeman, Ambassador Freeman, is a veteran of the U.S. Foreign Service, served in various capacities in the Departments of State and Defense, including Assistant Secretary of Defense, and also served in the region as well as other regions around the world, but in the region as ambassador to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. He is former president of a think tank here in Washington, Middle East Policy Council in the DC area. Layla Shahid. Layla is a prominent Palestinian diplomat. She represented Palestine as ambassador in Ireland, the Netherlands, and France. From 2006 to 2014, she was General Delegate of Palestine, Ambassador of Palestine to the European Union, also Belgium and Luxembourg. Again, my name is Khalid Jahshan, and I'm Executive Director of Arab Center, Washington. Welcome to all of you. Let's go ahead and engage in the art of conversation. And let me begin with the first question addressed to Diana. Before we delve into the comparison, if you will, US and EU foreign policies toward the raging war on Gaza and on Lebanon these days, could you tell us a little bit about what this war is all about? Is it a new conflict in the Middle East, or is it a continuation of the 76-year-old Arab-Israeli conflict? And did history, as some try to imply, begin on October 7, 23, or do we have really a prelude to the events we are witnessing before our eyes today?
First of all, thank you. Thank you very much, Khalil, for inviting me. Thank you to you, Isabel, as well for the invitation. And I want to thank my fellow panelists. I'm actually very honored to be sharing the stage with you because there's so many of you I've looked up to for quite some time. In terms of what is this all about, you know, Khalil, it's one of the things that has been become so apparent in the 1 year as we mark 1 year is the level of dehumanization of Palestinians. And the level of dehumanization of Palestinians runs so deep that we're able to allow genocide to take place for over a year. And we're able to, the world is able to gloss over the genocide that's been taking place over the course of the past year. At the same time, Palestinians have been told time and again that everything that Israel did up till October the 7th was no justification for October the 7th. And at the same time, the world is telling Palestinians that because of October 7th, everything that has been done since to Palestinians has been justified by October the 7th. So the reason I'm mentioning this dehumanization is because this isn't new, obviously. The origins go back to Zionism and the idea of the takeover of Palestine by the Zionist forces. The only way that Zionism and that Zionists were able to take over and ethnically cleanse Palestine through the years of 1947 through 1949 was through this very deep dehumanization of Palestinians. The only way that you can look around and say, yes, this is going to be my land, or yes, I'm even going to live in your house, and yes, I'm even going to sleep in your bed and use your kitchen utensils and so on, is if you genuinely believe that Palestinians don't exist and that they don't have any rights. And so what we've been seeing over the course of the past year is just the ways in which this dehumanization has taken shape, to the point where we've seen mangled body after mangled body after mangled body of Palestinian children. We've seen hospitals attacked, schools attacked, shelters attacked. We've seen starvation. All of these things happening before our very eyes. It's the only televised genocide of our time. And yet it hasn't actually changed any policy. Quite the opposite. We're now seeing that it's digging in deeper, that Israel's now talking about changing the Middle East. They're talking about leadership and regime change. And so when you ask the issue of, did history begin on October the 7th? Obviously it did not, but the Zionists would have you believe that it did.
Thank you, Diana. Let me move on to Ambassador Freeman. Ambassador Freeman, as a veteran of the U.S. Foreign Service, I would like to ask you if you could help us with a basic question. What on earth is the U.S. doing in Gaza? Why are we involved in this conflict? And what's our objective? I mean, you know, where is the national interest of this country involved in this raging war, and have these objectives that we set for ourselves in Gaza, have they changed? Let's say, when you look back a year, are these the same objectives we have on October 10, 2023, the same objectives we have today in 24?
I think there's a huge rift in the United States between the establishment, which is continuing the policies that it has followed for a long, long time without change, despite the horrors that Diana Buttu correctly referred to. What has happened is contrary to every U.S. interest that I defended during my time as a professional diplomat. This conflict and the management of it by the United States and Europe has trashed international law and respect for the institutions that are meant to administer it. It has destroyed any pretense of Western moral authority in the world at large. It has confirmed, I think, the end of the 500-year period of European domination of the world, Euro-Atlantic domination, or the 225 years of European imperialism in the Middle East. This is over. And basically, I don't think it's accurate, Diana, to say that the world has glossed over what has happened. The West has glossed over what has happened. The global majority is thoroughly turned off by this, sees Israel as diabolical in its approach to achieving a land without people in Palestine, the original vision of Zionism. And meanwhile, the United States clearly no longer has any clout in the Middle East. We have no influence. Every time we have provided advice, assuming it was sincere, which is possibly not true, to the government of Israel, it has basically treated our advice with contempt. And I cannot imagine any human being more humiliated than President Biden over the past year in that regard. The U.S. has been shown to be weak. It has been shown to be allied with genocide, and it has shown to be supportive of the latest Israeli outrage, which is the invasion of Lebanon. So basically, we end up, to go to the basic question of this webinar, we end up with the United States revealed as the reliable instrument of Israeli foreign policy and the pursuit of Israeli interests at the expense of its own. And how you can explain that, Khalil, you know better than I, because you have done a lot of domestic American politics, and I've tried very hard to stay away from them. This is a projection of American domestic politics into the international sphere. It is not a rational foreign policy, or it has no strategy. As a professional diplomat, I find it greatly wanting.
It's very interesting, Ambassador Freeman, that this is exactly the same warning we have received from our first president, George Washington, in his farewell address, as to not to fall in this trap of being either in love or in a hateful relationship with a foreign entity that is apt to distract us from our national interest. And
ironically, he was speaking of the French.
Exactly.
When he denounced the idea of a passionate attachment as the basis for policy. Yes. But he was right in principle, yes. Even if he might have been wrong about France ultimately.
The wrong identity, but the principle stands. Karim, let me move to you. In terms of this event in Gaza 12 months ago, that seemed to be geographically limited initially. And now we look at it from an international perspective. It seems to have morphed into an international event, threatening world security and stability, expanding from this initial front in Gaza to becoming, somebody described it on the news today, as a seven-front conflict, and of course, including, in addition to Gaza, the West Bank and now Lebanon. So it has become a regional and international confrontation, at least on 5 to 7 fronts. It depends, I guess, on the writer. How did that happen? Microphone, please.
Thank you, Khalil, for having me. I would also like to say that I'm really happy to be sharing this panel with distinguished figures, particularly my old friend Layla Shahid. I realize every single day how difficult when it's in tragic circumstances to speak with Western media. And I remember that 20, 30 years ago, Layla Shahid was perhaps the only Arab voice that could reach the Western audience with a passionate, principled discourse without ever compromising, and yet forcefully and humanely. So thank you, Layla. You were a trailblazer. Diana, I think in the past few years has also been following this path and addressing Western audiences. This is fundamental. I'm also happy to be sharing the panel with Ambassador Freeman, who is one of the very few diplomats who is still read by international relations scholars and by students up to this day. Your articles about the beginning of the Iraq War, the global war on terror, and its tragic counterproductive consequences are still widely read. And thank you for your courage. Regarding your question, Khalil, I think indeed this is much more than a Middle Eastern episode, a new Middle Eastern episode. I think Gaza marks the moment where the world arguably has splintered into two. The legacies of the Holocaust, the legacies of colonialism, and the post 9/11 atmosphere of dehumanization of global war on terror have led to this deepening of all fault lines throughout the world. So the main lesson of the past 12 months was basically the persistence of the Palestinian question. Many people felt that they could forget about it, that they could move on, they could proceed with the normalization with certain Arab Gulf countries, notwithstanding the rights and the claims of Palestinians. The persistence and also the centrality and the universality of the Palestinian question. It remains central. 20 years ago, they told us that they could start by overthrowing Saddam Hussein in Iraq, that it would lead to a domino effect, to democratization of the Middle East. And we realize today what a giant hoax that was. Bibi Netanyahu himself went to Washington, D.C., and he says, I guarantee you that it will have positive repercussions throughout the Middle East. Today, we realize that it has cost over 1 million civilian deaths. Religious minorities were decimated. Iran is stronger than ever. And if Iran today is able to have allies in every single country and open up to the Mediterranean, this is to a large extent due to the mistakes of the Bush administration. And the tragic irony is that the same voices who were cheerleaders for the Iraq war are now helping Israel and Benjamin Netanyahu trying to go to the United States, to get the United States to attack Iran and to embroil the United States into a wider war. So we have this feeling of déjà vu in the Middle East, but we are entering a new phase, an extension of the domain of terror. What is happening as we speak in Lebanon, my native country, is absolutely horrendous. It is a continuation of what has been happening in Gaza. The Israelis initially called it the Dahiya doctrine. The idea was to level up an entire neighborhood. And no one is safe today in Lebanon. Israel is indiscriminately targeting civilians, ambulances. Yesterday, a church in South Lebanon. We have seen this in 2006 with the Qana massacre, in 1996 with the first Qana massacre. And what is particularly striking is the total irrelevance of this quote-unquote international community. And when it comes to the United States, it's not that the United States is powerless, it's that the United States is simply unwilling to use the enormous leverage that it has on Israel. Israel has been the largest recipient of US foreign aid since 1948. If we look at the numbers in terms of purchasing power parity, we have already exceeded $250 billion. Mostly since the beginning of the 1970s, $250 billion of US aid. The United States has used its veto at the United Nations Security Council over 50 times to protect Israel. And even minor measures, they sanctioned a handful of settlers last year. but it is still possible when you live in the United States to make a donation, to build a settlement on territory that is recognized by the United States itself as being occupied territory in international law. So even these simple measures like preventing donors from supporting new settlements has not been taken. So what is happening 20 years after all the lies that preceded the Iraq War is yet another time a complete collapse of Western credibility. And I think we're supposed to talk about also European foreign policy. In 2003, some European countries stood against the Iraq invasion. France took the lead with the famous Dominique de Villepin speech at the United Nations. The Vatican was also very hostile to the Iraq war, and this was instrumental because it prevented this from turning into a clash of civilizations, the entire West homogeneously attacking an Arab country. Today, we have the feeling that we are no longer hearing a contrarian discourse in Europe. Most European countries have sort of adopted the US line with minor divergences from time to time. And yet, as Ambassador Freeman said, public opinion is not exactly on the same line. In Europe, you have massive demonstrations. People in Ireland, in Scotland, are also very supportive of Palestine. And this shows that it's not a fight between the so-called collective West and the so-called global South. It is mostly, if you look at the fault lines, what is the major foundational traumas? For the Irish and the Scots, it's very often their confrontation with colonialism, with empire. The same goes for Latin American countries, very deeply Catholic countries who are also protesting against what is happening in Palestine. For most European countries, the foundational trauma remains the Holocaust, and so far they have been unable to overcome the guilt associated with the Holocaust and to distance themselves from the United States, even when they know full well that these policies are extraordinarily counterproductive and that they will basically undermine the entire so-called liberal world order that they have been preaching about for the past 60 years.
Thank you, Karim. Let me go now to Ambassador Freeman again. Chaz, you are the author of one of my favorite publications, America's Misadventures in the Middle East. And it's a long list, unfortunately. If I were to suggest to you to update this publication, would you include the Gaza war in your list, and why?
No, definitely. In fact, there is a continuation, America's continuing misadventures in the Middle East. And I would argue I should write a third book, America's further misadventures in the Middle East. And Gaza would figure very high in that list. But I want to say, Khalil, if I may, that we need to think about what is happening, not just in tactical terms, but in strategic terms. And Hamas on October 7th, whatever you think of the atrocities that accompanied its breakout from the world's largest concentration camp, succeeded in putting the Palestinian agenda firmly on the global agenda over the opposition of the United States and the countries in Western Europe that Karim mentioned. So from a tactical point of view, this may have turned out to be a disaster, but from the strategic point of view of the pursuit and legitimation of Palestinian self-determination, it is a victory. Conversely, Israel has pursued an agenda which Diana began to mention. From the very beginning, it has desired to depopulate Palestine so as to be able to settle it. And it has seized on October 7th as the pretext for continuing the 100-year struggle to do that. So you have genocide in Gaza, you have pogroms in the West Bank. That is an intensified effort at ethnic cleansing and a lot of violence by the settlers. You have now the invasion of southern Lebanon, the bombing of Beirut, the Dahia Doctrine, which was mentioned. And in doing this, Israel has strengthened itself tactically at the expense of a strategic defeat, because it no longer has the admiration of the world's people. the excuse that was offered by the Holocaust, that we are victims and therefore we should be immune from the consequences of our actions, is gone. I don't think in the United States, which has been the most stalwart supporter of Israel over this entire period, as Karim mentioned, that Israel's support is sustainable. It is a generational thing now with young people, very much of a different view than their elders. Anyway, I would say that the misadventures continue. This is in part because the relationship between Israel and the United States resembles nothing so much as that between the Lone Ranger and Tonto, which, by the way, means stupid in Spanish. So we are the faithful follower of an uncontrolled and utterly degrading foreign policy by Israel, or domestic policy, I should say. So I'll end here. I will talk, if you want, Khalil, about a little bit about our domestic politics.
Yeah,
because
I'll come back to you on that one, definitely.
All right. Well, you're welcome to do so.
Layla, as Karim reminded us, you represented the Palestinian cause, if you will, internationally for quite a few years as an experienced diplomat based mostly in Europe. This event we are talking about, October 7, has definitely had a lot of political and diplomatic fallout. And it seems to be kind of becoming a larger than life event. I don't know, the other day I ventured and said that to me, it's reminiscent of 67, how 67 kind of changed the politics of the region. I have a feeling this small event is reaching that level and will, in the future, change a lot of things. Could you, as someone who has an experienced diplomat who has represented the Palestine issue for so long, can you tell us how October 7 has impacted Palestinian politics and the Palestinian cause? What's the future of Palestine after this?
Let me start, Khalil, by saying how happy I am, first of all, to re-establish contact with you. I haven't seen you for years. And to find again my friend Diana Bhutto and Karim. And very happy to discover Ambassador Freeman, because what he says is so much against the trend in the US. I don't think that 7th of October is the beginning of the tragedy. And I call it a tragedy, not an event.
Yeah.
The beginning of really this last series of massacres, of denials of humanity, of destruction of culture, of destruction of every mean of survival of any community in the world, is a major historical event. And it does not only concern Israelis and Palestinians, it concerns the world. It concerns, obvious example is, why are we talking of US and European policy? Which means that what happened also concerns the US and Europe. And I would say the Arab world, particularly the Gulf countries, because remember that on the eve of the 7th of October, there were Arab countries in the Gulf, but also Morocco. I'll remind people that it also included the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Sudan was forced really to get to that Abraham Accord because they wanted the money to rebuild their country. But I think that we tend to forget that major leaders of the army who are now retired, and the Israeli press, which I would like to salute because often it's much better than European press, told us that the army had a copy of the plan of Hamas to enter Israel, kidnap and take hostage a number of military people, not massacre civilians, which is unfortunately what happened, and this was unacceptable. But I think they were outrun by the rage of the people who were behind them. They thought, and it was, of course, mainly their leader, that they could take hostages in order to negotiate the release of other hostages. That was the promise that, bear with me because I'm getting old and I forgot names. The name of the Hamas leader is
Sinwar.
Sinwar. The day he was able to leave the prison in exchange of Shalit, put his hand on his breast and told his comrades in the prison, I promise you, I'll get you out of your cells. And I think that contrary to what people think, he decided and prepared and studied and found the people to do it because mainly he thought that he could negotiate the freedom of his comrades who stayed in prison. I would like to remind the people who look at us that they are between 8 and 10,000, who many of them have never passed in front of a judge or accused of any specific act. Now, of course, this, like Diana said, does not excuse the horrors of what happened. And I would like to say to Ambassador Friedman that we should not forget that we must not accept the assassination of civilians anywhere. Not in Israel, not in Palestine, not in Lebanon, not in Vietnam, not in South Africa, anywhere. Of course, sometimes you can't evade it, but I cannot accept the idea that a revolution has to deal with things like mass assassination of civilians. We don't need it. It would have been much better had they only attacked the military camp at the border of Gaza. Now, I think from the beginning, Khalil, you talk about my diplomatic experience. I'm a humble servant of the Palestinian cause, but because when you are the ambassador of a leader like Arafat, you have to accompany your leader to all the meetings, whether in Europe or in Ireland or in France, and then you listen and you open your eyes and you try to understand how the world functions. The world functions much better when there was the Cold War, because in the face of the US, there was another power, which was the Soviet power. It's not exactly the sort of regime I like, but it sort of balanced the superpower of the US in the world. And I think the Israelis knew from the beginning that what they were doing in Gaza will expand. They wanted it to expand. And you saw Mr. Netanyahu at the General Assembly, he got two drawings, one which was all black, and the other where you saw pipelines going from Yemen, Saudi Arabia, Oman, all the way to Ashdod. That was the expression of what he was doing. He was telling the whole world, while insulting the General Assembly and the UN, because they said they were all anti-Semites, he was telling them, choose, what do you want? In other words, the plan in the head of probably the worst government in Israel we have ever seen in 76 years was to reorganize the Middle East. And he is saying it openly. He is saying it, his comrades in the government are saying it. But don't forget that this is not 67. This is the worst government we have ever seen, with Jewish supremacists, racists, fascists, who want to grab the land wherever they can. In South Lebanon, this is what they have been doing now, ethnic cleansing South Lebanon in order to take over the territory from the border to the Litani River. They ethnic cleansed Gaza, although the population did not leave, but there's nothing left for them to live on. They did the same with camps in the West Bank, and I think they will continue. We don't know who is the next victim, but they have the ambition, because the US has been such a support, and the US is the strongest country in the world, and the EU, I'll say it how I feel it, are such cowards that they don't exist. As long as America says that should be the rule, this is the way it is. And also Europe, unfortunately, is moving to the right, and I would say even the extreme right. You have today people like Madame Le Pen and her organization, her party, I don't even call it a party, an organization, has taken over from Republican parties. I'm not even talking of leftist party, rightist, center parties, because there is a change in the composition of political circles in the world. Now, I think that after 9/11, and I had a very, very small hope when Biden said to the Israelis, don't do the same mistake as we did. Don't let vengeance, revenge, hatred give you the feeling that the best way to answer is to hit and kill and create war, particularly if you invent the enemy. Remember that they destroyed Iraq. They didn't only kill Saddam, they destroyed the country, and it'll take 50 years to rebuild it because they pretended that bin Laden was hiding in Baghdad and he was supported by the Iraqis. Years later, the US administration recognized that they went all the way to Afghanistan to kill him. So I think, I don't know who among you talked about the fact that this is part of the post 9/11 and the supposedly anti-terror war is one of the reasons why there is such impunity with what Israel is doing. We have never seen this sort of massacre for the hundred years back, including in Israel, in Palestine, in the colonies, like Ambassador Friedman said, whether in Algeria or anywhere in South Africa, at this level of barbarian attitudes. And I think the reason is because in some way, the non-state actors have taken over. When you destroy states, like they destroyed Iraq, like they destroyed Libya, like they are destroying Yemen today, like for internal reasons and not for external reasons, Lebanon, Syria are failed states, they are replaced by the non-state actors, from Hamas to all the other movements that are taking over from states. And this is an open door for the lack of respect for international law. Non-state actors don't give a damn about international law or the Declaration of Human Rights or the Geneva Conventions. The only thing they believe in is force. And because military might seems to be the only thing the American administration believes in. Because Mr. Biden says, I agree that we should have a ceasefire, and the next day he sends more weapons and more ammunition, as if he takes the words for a ride, as if he thinks that the world is made of ignorant, simple-minded, naive people who will believe that you can say something and do the contrary.
Yeah,
I think we are going through something. We are going through something that is an earthquake. And we will see more and more results because it will introduce new chaos in the world. And Israel has manipulated very well. And I think from the beginning, it was their intention. That's why they did nothing about the report that was given to the army concerning Hamas plans and at least Sinwar's plans. And I don't know, I'm here with very prominent analysts, and I agree that whether Karim or Diana have been approaching all this issue very well. I follow them in the media, and I understand from you that Ambassador Friedman does the same. I think media is a very, very important tool to reestablish the truth and not go into all these, bear with me, I have to go back to English after having spoken in French for so long. Stereotypes.
You're doing fine.
Stereotypes of Arabs, stereotypes of Muslims, stereotypes, not even mentioning that a lot of Arabs are Christian too. This have been eliminated. And the fact that we are going into civil wars again, including in Israel. That's why I think it's an earthquake and it will have very, very important consequences. And I don't see who is the world leader who can lead in such a tragic time.
Thank you, Leila. Karim, I would like to follow up on one of the challenging ideas that Leila just mentioned. The kind of almost like schizophrenic aspect of US policy in the sense of the same administration that keeps saying there is no difference between our position and that of the Israeli government, that Israel has the right to defend itself. They've been mimicking that, repeating that from day one. and at the same time, furnishing Israel with the military, financial, and diplomatic means it needs to continue to do that war. Yet at the same time, comes back to tell us that it's pursuing a ceasefire, and we need to focus on the humanitarian need. How do you see this contradictory? Are these reconcilable objectives?
I'm not sure. Actually, I have rarely seen such an unprecedented degree of hubris on the part of Israel, but also on the part of the United States. And there are many similarities with the post 9/11 phase. Throughout history, as Paul Kennedy showed in his book On the Rise and Fall of Great Powers, hubris always led to overstretch, imperial overreach, and overstretch then led to decline. Several empires throughout history fell because of hubris and arrogance. The United States, after 9/11, succumbed to this imperial temptation, invaded Afghanistan and Iraq, and was also, through special operations, active in several countries in North Africa and even in the Horn of Africa. And this contributed to accelerating the decline of US power, and people started talking about the post-American Middle East. I view today's Israeli policies as replicating the mistakes that were done by the Bush administration after 9/11. They should have heeded the advice of people like George Kennan, who was not a peacenik, who was not a woke liberal. George Kennan was a conservative figure, the father of the containment doctrine, and he always reminded his audience that military might is not a joystick. You cannot reshape entire regions if you are an armchair expert sitting in a Washington, D.C. think tank. They also did not heed the lesson from basically Pogo. We have met the enemy and he is us. Very often it is America's own misperceptions of the rest of the world that leads to these tragic policies. And I'm afraid the Europeans are not playing the role they should play. As Leila said, there is a shift towards the radical right in Europe, and there is also a shift of the center of gravity of Europe, as Donald Rumsfeld pointed out 20 years ago, from Western Europe to Eastern Europe. And Eastern Europe tends to be overwhelmingly aligned with the United States. They feel that because the United States supported them during the Cold War, they owe it to the United States to be supportive even when they disagree. Even former Czech President Václav Havel, who was a major intellectual and playwright, at the time of the Iraq War, he knew fully well that it would lead to disaster, but he felt that he had a debt towards the United States. So he was silent. Other countries were supportive. And today we have Mr. Orban in Hungary, who is also close to Mr. Putin. We have some sort of authoritarian axis that is emerging. And the tragic irony, we were mentioning the global war on terror, is that most Arab dictators ended up internalizing this logic and throwing activists in jail, journalists, trade unionists, writers, using the exact same logic of the war on terror. They are opposed to us, we stick the label terrorist on them, and it is a license to imprison, to kill, to torture. So the time has come for the entire West to get out of this state of mind, to realize that the Middle East cannot be shapen by brute force, to come back to international law. Dozens of UN resolutions have remained ink on paper, and this is the key aspect. If you look at the core strategic interests of the United States, if we think in terms of patterns of change and continuities, they have not changed much. The security of Israel, Saudi Arabia, preventing nuclear proliferation, etc. But the world is changing at an unprecedented pace. When the UN emerged in 1945, the world was an entirely different world. The South had not yet emerged. Many countries were still colonies, and it is unacceptable to billions of people in today's world that the United States is still using its veto right. And I would say the same about Russia using its veto right to protect the Assad regime in Syria. There is a need for an overhaul of the United Nations system, but currently I do not see any possibility of this overhaul. So indeed, as Leila said, the battle today is a battle of public opinion. We are in the midst of very intense culture wars. In every single country, there is a deep divide between the pro-Israeli talking points and the pro-Palestinian views. And on this front, I think the Arab world still has work to do and can make progress. In 1967, an overwhelming majority of French intellectuals from left to right, even Sartre, Foucault, leftist intellectuals, supported Israel. Today, we are seeing lots of voices in Europe that are critical of Israel. We are seeing protests on major university campuses. This was unprecedented. Even in the United States in 2003, we did not have massive demonstrations. So when this generation reaches positions of power 10 or 15 years from now, Israel will have to be sincerely worried, seriously worried, because this is when we might witness a change in US foreign policy, but this requires intense lobbying, diplomatic efforts, and a mobilization of Arab public opinion and building bridges with liberals throughout the world and progressives throughout the world, not only in the global South, but also in the United States. Someone mentioned the farewell address of George Washington. If you read all the first 5 or 6 presidents, they were extremely prescient. There is an anti-imperial tradition in America. People in the Middle East tend to view America as a monolithic imperialist country, but also Jefferson and John Quincy Adams all warned in their farewell addresses to the nation against these imperial temptations. Do not go abroad looking for monsters to destroy. So the fight will be won only when we connect Arab public opinion, the global South progressives, and also US liberals who are sick and tired of these misguided foreign policies.
Thank you, Karim. Diana, in terms of talking about public opinion, let's shift a little bit of attention to the kind of EU policies, a little bit away from US policies. How are European policies perceived by Palestinians? And is there a gap between official policy in Palestine and public opinion in Palestine towards European policies and attitudes?
So there's a very popular map that you can see now in the West Bank. And this very popular map that you see in the West Bank, it's only got 2 countries listed in Europe, being Spain and Ireland. And then the rest of it is not there. And the reason that it's these 2 countries is because it's these 2 countries that have come out and been have expressed their very strong support against this genocide and against what Israel is doing, with the rest of the countries being quite mealy-mouthed, I have to say, when it comes to the genocide and its support for genocide. This was particularly telling as we passed the 1-year mark, when we saw talking point after talking point on Twitter, X, whatever you want to call it, where it practically was practically a copy paste of the Israeli talking points of how it is that they view October the 7th, using practically the exact same phraseology. So, and it's important to keep in mind that for Palestinians, this isn't just the question of how Europe has behaved now. It's also a question of how Europe has been behaving over the past few decades. Now, bear in mind the vast majority of the population is under the age of 30. So we're talking about 3 decades, which is also the 3 decades that I can speak best towards. And in those 3 decades, we haven't seen that there's been any significant change between what US foreign policy is and what the Europeans are. There are some differences, and I'm the first to recognize that. But on the whole, as somebody who, if you were just to look at the way in which these policies are enacted, they seem to be very much the same. And we feel this not just when it comes to the statements of support, but also onto the level of funding. Europeans have succumbed to a lot of pressure by the Zionists to no longer fund Palestinian civil society organizations, including an attempt to try to crush organizations like Al-Haq, like Damir, like Defense for Children International, all of these organizations that are pushing for accountability, Israel to be held accountable. And sadly, the Europeans have fallen along this same vein. I want to say something, though, about what Karim said when it comes to empire. And I think that this is very important because as somebody who watches and consumes both the Western press as well as the local press in both languages, the face that is presented, the Israeli face that is presented to the West is a very different face that is presented inwardly. And the face that's presented to the talking points that are given to the West are very different than the ones that are spoken inside. So the face that's presented to the West is that of the victim, the person who has been aggrieved. That it's not only over and over recalling the Holocaust, but even the talking points were the largest number of deaths on any single day since the Holocaust. Inside, that is not, and so therefore the victim. Inside, the talking point is quite the opposite. We are the powerful. We are the strong. We are the aggressor. We are going to show them who's boss. We are going to humiliate them. And that's what accounts for all of these videos that you may or may not have been seeing, the TikTok videos, the Instagram videos, the people dancing as they're blowing up, the Israeli soldiers dancing as they're blowing up Palestinian homes, the Israeli soldiers going into Palestinian homes and wearing women's lingerie, the destruction of the universities. This is all very much an internal talking point. Similarly, as he was talking about the idea of empire, to the West, what they're saying, the outward message is that of self-defense, and it's needed, and we need to protect ourselves. And yet the internal message that is given to Israelis is it's time for regime change. And we have the ability to change all of these regimes. We, the Israelis, not numbering more than 10 million, have the ability to change the Iranian government, which represents 100 million Iranians. We, the Israelis, have the ability to change the Lebanese government. We, the Israelis, have the ability to change the Syrian government. We, the Israelis, also have the ability to take over southern Lebanon and build houses there. There are advertisements going out for the construction of houses in southern Lebanon. We, the Israelis, have the ability to build settlements in Gaza. They're actually doing boat tours for people so that they can see what has happened in Gaza for potential sites for settlements. So the dialogue that is given outward versus inward is so very different. And the only way that you can truly understand what Israel intends to do is to understand and listen to that internal dialogue, because that's the dialogue that they continue to pursue. And that's the one that they're pushing with the public here.
Thank you, Diana. Leila, is there, I mean, in talking about European policy towards the war on Gaza or Palestine in general, is there a unified European policy, or are we talking about policies?
You are totally right. And it doesn't concern only Palestine. The ununited position on international politics or foreign politics. You think they agree on Ukraine? They don't agree on anything, because from the onset, what they did was a very, very naive choice, is that it should be a unanimity vote. In other words, the 27, as England has left, have to agree, all of them, on the same position. Otherwise, it's not a decision. That's why ultimately the EU became an economic trade organization that does bilateral agreements, very often very generous ones. The Commission, there are three institutions: the Parliament, the Commission, and the Council of Ministers. The Parliament is the most democratic because it represents people who were elected by the population of the 27 countries, but it has no executive power whatsoever. The Commission are the technicians who go to the countries, who observe elections, who are really the ones probably who know best all these countries that have relations with the EU. And then there is the Council of Ministers, which is totally paralyzed by the fact that they are never unanimous about any decision, to start with European politics. So, of course, much less about Palestine. But what Diana just analyzed is so interesting, because when I spent 10 years in Brussels, and I went to talk very often to people who out of their office and on personal basis told me le fond de leur pensée, the real conviction. They said what she said, is that you have to understand that we have a schizophrenic attitude towards Israel. For us, Israel is the country of the survival of the victims of the Holocaust. The Holocaust was done by Europeans, not by Arabs, nor Palestinians, nor Lebanese. So we don't really know how to tackle this issue of our hesitation to treat Israel like any other state when it violates international law, international humanitarian law, or the Geneva Conventions, or just values, normal human values. We don't dare tell them. That's why they found the best what you put on a field in order to get the birds away, anti-Semitism. The minute you open your mouth, you can be a president, a prime minister, a minister, a leader of opinion, an intellectual, you are accused of anti-Semitism. And don't underestimate how much it has effect on people. I have a friend who was a very great journalist in Paris. He accompanied elected members of the parliament in 2002. He interviewed most of them. He interviewed also many Israelis, including survivors of the Holocaust. When he came back, all the team of journalists called him anti-Semite. He lost 20 kilos. Edgar Morin is one of the most important philosophers of our time. He was accused of anti-Semitism because in an article on the front page of Le Monde, he dared say that Israel in this part of the world is like a tumor. He had to go to court. He had to go, this man who's a Jew, who is a resistant from the occupation against Nazis, had a nervous breakdown. So I think that this is the only conflict in the world where the psychological, psychoanalytical, historical part of the identity is very difficult to deal with. That's why Diana just told you what a schizophrenic attitude there is between what they say in the West, we are the victims, we are the poor ones, we are the survivors of a terrible, which is true, terrible, probably the worst that ever happened in the world, the Holocaust. But inside, they want to show, on the contrary, like Karim said, hubris, self-confidence, brutality, that they are the strongest. They even give orders to the American administration and the American president. But this will not really give Israel a possibility of surviving in that area. Nobody dares say that. Even when they went 800,000, 700,000, 500,000 to protest, they went to protest about the juridical changes that Mr. Netanyahu wants to move forward because he doesn't want to be persecuted or prosecuted by the tribunal for all the corruption accusation he has. So there is some sort of this national unity need. Don't forget that Israel is only 76 years old. It's a new country. It's a young country. And the army has a state. Not the state has an army. My Israeli friends tell me, you don't understand. The army is the core. And because the army is the core, whenever it is at war, it unites people. It's peace that threatens Israel. It's not war that threatens Israel. Peace threatens because it becomes a normal country that has to live with its neighbors. That's why I said there will be civil war. Because more and more people, more and more Israeli citizens realize the minute the Israelis will change, the Europeans will change. Because their guilt feeling will have to adapt to the new situation in Israel. And I think Israel will change. There is no way, after all what happened, there is no way they can hide all the, what I would say, probably painful ideas that come to Israelis when they look, if they are allowed to look, because don't forget, they have erased the image of the Palestinian victims. No journalist has the right to go into Gaza. It's not a coincidence, because with ethnic cleansing, the most important tragedy of the Palestinians is their faces were erased. We are numbers. The hostages, their pictures are all over Israel. They are all over Paris, even on the municipality of Paris, while the faces of the Palestinian victims are never there. The only channel that we can see is the one they closed, which is Al Jazeera, because Al Jazeera has like 20 correspondents in Gaza and another 20 in the West Bank. But they're also killing them. There's more than 170 Palestinians. So the erasing of the identity is even more than the dehumanization, because suddenly Palestinians don't exist. Remember that. That's why I say it's not new. It's from the beginning, from the onset, that the idea is to erase the existence of a people. That's why they destroy libraries, universities, archaeological sites. Gaza is older than any other city in Palestine. It goes back to the Bronze Age. They have bombarded all the sites where excavations were done. Why this insistence on erasing culture if they are fighting Hamas? Why do they bombard archaeological sites and the museum with all what was found by archaeologists? So you see, it's not a war. I don't call it a war because we are not an army. And Benin's people are not an army. The ones who are fighting are Hezbollah and the people of the south who want to keep their land. So there is a dimension which is not a normal war. We're not fighting for a number of kilometers or a border. We're fighting for our right to exist. And this does not exist in any other conflict.
Thank you, Leila. Ambassador Freeman, in light of what we just heard about the EU lack of unified policy and multiple policies here, you've worked in the belly of the beast, policy making in Washington in various capacities. How do American policymakers look at European allies, European policymakers? Do they take Europeans seriously on policies, particularly on issues like the Middle East? And why are the European allies themselves willing to defer to the US on the Middle East as if it's like Biden's backyard or something?
Well, it's not news that Europe is much less than the sum of the parts.
Yep.
You remember the famous Kissinger question, if I want to have a conversation with Europe, what's the telephone number? Who do I call? But I think things are changing. I think there is quite a bit of motion in Europe. I don't agree, by the way, at all that with the Biden administration and the NATO refrain that the world is organized around great power rivalry and a tremendous struggle between democracy and autocracy. This is not what is happening. What is happening is the emergence of middle-ranking powers. As the old order collapses, we see countries that were previously without influence or ideas now coming forth. And in the case of Europe, there is a drive for strategic autonomy from the United States, an effort to wean Europe from American primacy and dictation. President Macron is trying to surf this wave, if you will. I think he fell off his surfboard a couple of times. It's a very Gaullist vision, but everyone in Europe is now hedging against American hegemony. That's what increased defense budgets mean. That's what disagreements about Ukraine mean. And I think this can't help but affect relations with West Asia. I don't like the term Middle East because that's a European term. It's the Far East for us. Anyway, so I would say what is happening has made Israel, contrary to Mr. Netanyahu's claims, not the defender of Western civilization, but the primary factor destroying its reputation globally. And Israel is also emerged in my country and in Europe, as Leila mentioned, as the main enemy of free speech. It is the negation of our First Amendment. And I think Diana's point about the difference between the domestic dialogue in Israel and the foreign propaganda of the Ministry of Strategic Affairs is very, very important. I see there is now circulating a conversation with Bezalel Smotrich from 2016, in which he says, we're going to take Lebanon, we're going to take Damascus, we're going to take Jordan, we're going to take northern Saudi Arabia, we're going to take part of Iraq. Why not? This is a perversion of the supposed gift to the sons of Abraham of this region. As I recall from my time in Saudi Arabia, Israelis are not the only sons of Abraham. So I think things are changing. And I'll make a final point here in response to something Karim said, which I think is also important. The United Nations has been one of the collateral damages of all of this, as has international law. The United States now espouses something called the rules-based order, which is basically the US and the G7, i.e. the club of former imperialist powers, make the rules, and we tell you which rules apply to whom and which don't, and we issue the orders. This is not international law. Whatever it is, it's a kind of dictatorship. I think the UN, however, has come to the level where it needs to be totally reorganized and probably replaced. The last time this happened, the League of Nations, it took a world war. Well, I'm sorry to tell you, we're working on one at the moment. We have not only the grave dangers and risks we are taking in Eastern Europe with Russia, but we have a comparable struggle in the offing with China over where its borders are. We are intervening in the Chinese Civil War. We are falling victim to Netanyahu's superb ability to manipulate us as to follow him into a broader war with Iran. And Israel, I would say, is now at war not only with Western ideals, but with the entire world. That is not a prescription for survival for the state of Israel. Leila mentioned 76 years. I believe that the Christian Crusader kingdoms lasted a little longer, but not that much longer. And Israel is a very sick society. All of those videos that Diana mentioned, which have been brilliantly assembled in an Al Jazeera compilation, show the sadism, the sociopathy, and the psychotic approach that Israel is taking to the world. And I think the barrier between what is said internally and what is propagandized externally is crumbling. And I don't think Israel can count on the perpetual support of Europe or the United States any more than the Christian Kingdom of Jerusalem was able to count forever on the support of the Crusaders.
Thank you, Chaz. Karim, can we focus a few minutes on the current situation in Lebanon? I've noticed the past few days, media-wise in Lebanon and social media in particular, I don't know, I'm hearing stuff reminiscent of what we used to hear, you and I, in the pre-Civil War years in the mid-70s. What is this all about? Where is Lebanon heading in the heat of this battle?
I'm really worried indeed. I think Lebanon is facing an existential threat. I usually use this word sparingly, but it's really existential. Even before the beginning of this new Israeli war on Lebanon, we were in the midst of state collapse. The Lebanese were still traumatized by the Beirut blast, by the financial collapse. We were already witnessing the rise of extremist rhetoric. People no longer believed in this Lebanese idea that we could live together in this part of the world as equals. We have to acknowledge that just like Israel and the United States often succumb to hubris, Hezbollah in the past 10 years also succumbed to hubris and overstretch. Hezbollah thought that it could simultaneously fight in Lebanon, fight in Syria alongside Bashar al-Assad, open a solidarity front with Gaza, support the Houthis in Yemen. And this overextension might have led also to Hezbollah's intelligence failures. The Financial Times revealed that Israel was able to penetrate Hezbollah intelligence when Hezbollah was present in Syria. On the Lebanese domestic arena, there is an intense polarization today. There is a threat for Lebanon actually has never been genuinely sovereign. It has never been a sovereign country. It was sort of a buffer state ever since it emerged in the international order in 1840. And even after its independence in 1943, it was only during the 1960s we had a brief experience of state building because Gamal Abdel Nasser and General de Gaulle both agreed to sort of dissociate Lebanon, and they entrusted General Fouad Shihab, who was a Lebanese president, a man of integrity, who built the few remaining institutions. Today, these institutions are crumbling. Lebanon is the ground where the proxy wars historically have been conducted. And you know the old African proverb that says, when two elephants fight, it is the grass that suffers. So the two elephants today are Iran and Israel. Iran and Israel are determined to go all the way. Apparently, the Israelis are keen on toppling the Iranian regime. This is a very serious possibility when Israel retaliates in the next few days. If the Iranians decide that they can no longer take humiliation and they start hitting back, the United States will have no choice but to support Israel once again. And this could open a new era of chaos, and I see a risk of fragmentation of Lebanese society. There is no president for the past 2 years. There's been a presidential vacuum. Parliament has become a one-man show, sort of hijacked by the Speaker of Parliament. And the few remaining institutions like the Lebanese army, the only non-sectarian or cross-sectarian institutions, are under serious financial constraints and surviving only because they are supported by France or Qatar or a few other countries. So this is simply unsustainable. And I think after this war, there is a need also for a complete reboot of the Lebanese system to finally move away from sectarianism, to build institutions based on democratic citizenship. But we should not give up on the idea of Christians and Muslims living together in this part of the world. Lebanon has often been described as the counter model as opposed to Israel, which is based on ethnic nationalism and religious exclusivism. Lebanon has been a system where people coexisted. It is a flawed system. The so-called consociational democracy is deeply flawed. Nonetheless, it became sort of a laboratory where people of all faiths could live together. If we manage to dissociate Lebanon from regional proxy wars and to build strong state institutions, Lebanon could remain one of the very few places in the Arab world where we could still have intellectual debates that could host people from who have been fleeing oppressive regimes throughout the region, just like it was in the 1960s. But we are at a turning point. This is also a cliche. Lebanon is at the crossroads. Now it is true. What is tragic in our day and age is that all the old cliches that we would laugh at, dancing on a volcano, being on the edge of the precipice, being at the crossroads, all these cliches are unfortunately truer than ever today.
Thank you, Karim. Ambassador Freeman, in response to that, the situation in Lebanon, I'm kind of intrigued by the reaction at the White House. And there seems to me kind of in a subtle way, if you probably read the Wall Street Journal this morning, today, where a senior White House official, Amos Hochstein, mentioned to Arab officials that the weakening of Hezbollah and the situation that Karim just described in Lebanon, he described it as, quote unquote, an opportunity to potentially break a political impasse in Lebanon. Is that a wise policy shift on the part of the Biden administration to get dragged into the chaos of Lebanese politics, as Tariq Mitri, the former foreign minister, just mentioned in an interview yesterday?
I don't think it's wise at all, but remember who Mr. Hochstein is. He is a veteran of the IDF. He is a dual national. This is, a ridiculous situation where the envoy of the United States to deal with Lebanon is an Israeli national. This is a disgrace, really. And so whether he represents anything other than a hybrid version of Mr. Netanyahu's vision of establishing Israeli hegemony and turning Lebanon into a satellite state, or something beyond that, is unclear to me. In any event, I don't think the White House has evidenced any wisdom or understanding of the basic dynamics in the region at all for years. And so, I just I can't take that seriously. I wanted to say, Khalil, if I may,
Please.
that, just to buttress the point that American policy is not driven by strategic reasoning, but by domestic politics. I happen to know one of the machers, the great power brokers in the Jewish community, now dead, who was at a meeting with Lyndon Johnson in Long Island in 1964. Lyndon Johnson had inherited the presidency from John F. Kennedy, who was assassinated. He was very unsure of himself, correctly so. He was running against Barry Goldwater. Barry Goldwater had the ardent support of the American right. And at this meeting, there were about a dozen members of a very prominent, wealthy Jewish donor class. And Lyndon Johnson did an explicit deal. Everybody forgets that after Suez, the United States had an arms embargo on Israel. He agreed to lift that arms embargo in return for electoral support. That is the basic bargain that drives U.S. policy to this day. I think it is collapsing because the kids won't have it anymore. But it'll take time. As you said, it will take time. And of course, we don't have much time because we're watching a rampage by Israel through the region, which is enormously destructive, ugly as it can get, and nobody's doing anything. And I think somebody pointed out correctly that Mr. Biden has the technical ability to stop this war. I think, he could do that. If Israel were deprived of further weapons and munitions supplies, within 2 weeks, it would come to a halt. This is what General Brick in Israel has said, and he's correct. So why didn't we do that? Well, the answer is we're in an election campaign, and the basic bargain that I mentioned is still alive. So we need to kill that bargain, but it's going to take time, and it will have to include, I think, Diana, the breakdown of the difference between domestic Israeli dialogue in Hebrew and foreign policy propaganda in English and French. So I hope that is something that is in progress, but I don't think any of us should hold our breath. It will take time.
Thank you. Layla, it seems that Netanyahu is adamant these days about escalating the clash with Iran. You know Europe better than any of us. Actually, yesterday, I think you probably heard that Biden had a phone conversation with Netanyahu, which was described by the White House as quote unquote direct and productive phone conversation. It seems like Netanyahu maybe got his way again. I mean, that's probably what they mean by that. But honestly, should escalation lead to regional war with Iran, which is most likely, and that has been an objective of Netanyahu for many, many years, actually long before this conflict. What are the European positions concerning attacking Iran at this time? Are they nervous about it? I mean, being in closer proximity to the region?
Well, funnily enough, I think this is the most dangerous point, is that on Iran, the EU is very close to the American position, unfortunately. They have developed a sort of demonization of Iran as a people, not only Iran as a regime. Ultimately, I think the Iranian people will bring down this religious regime of mullahs who is unbearable first and foremost to the Iranian people. But the way the world has treated Iran in the last 20 years is so unanimously united on the idea that one has to militarily attack, going all the way to discussing whether they attack the uranium sites or they attack the petroleum sites. I mean, is anybody with some sort of mental health can discuss the idea of sending nukes on the uranium plants? I can't imagine how it even passes in the brains of any normal person. In Europe, I think, in the member states, put aside what Diana told you, Spain and Ireland and a few other countries like Belgium, who doubt the utility of hitting Iran. The rest of the EU countries, and Karim was very right, the Eastern European countries, what we call the New Europe. Jacques Chirac used to say the Old Europe and the New Europe. The Old Europe being the rest of the countries that were already not in the system of the Soviet circles. And the Eastern European are so pro-American because they feel they owe their freedom to America. They will follow what Biden will say. And I want to add to what Ambassador Friedman said, which was very interesting, on the relation of international politics to domestic politics. It's exactly the same in the EU member states, not the Scandinavian ones, but what you call the Latin states. Belgium, France, Germany, Italy, Spain. The position you have towards Israel, the position the lobbies will accept or fight against, makes or unmakes elected people, from the members of the parliament to the president of the republic. So there is a domestic dimension that is very important in the attitudes concerning Palestine and concerning Israel. And I have to say, Khalil, you will understand because you have been working on Arab politics for half a century. The Arab states are no help. The Arab states have disregarded completely international law, humanitarian law, the human rights of people, their own citizens. Their own citizens to start with. And they are of no use for our societies, the regimes. I want to tell Ambassador Friedman that it's not because I am a radical militant that I say that. It is the truth. Look at what is happening in North Africa. Look at what's happening in the Gulf states. Look at the whole world is moving with civil societies towards democracy. Slowly, as Ambassador Friedman said, it'll take time. But we see the vitality of this society, including in Palestine. Young people are not at all desperate. They don't like the regime. Like I said about the other regimes, they think that President Abbas's regime is as useless as the Arab regime, but they have vitality. While in most of the Arab world, they're crushing the vitality of civil societies. So for all these reasons, I think that it must be a historical change because we all need it for different reasons. We Palestinians need it because we are paying with the Lebanese the biggest price, but I think all the other countries also, including Iran, where women have been at the forefront of fight for democracy, and they will win ultimately, but not because American support or Israeli bombardment of petroleum sites or uranium sites. And for all these reasons, I think we are already in the regional war. It's not coming, it's there. Mm-hmm. It's not yet totally military. In other words, like in Lebanon and in Palestine and in Gaza in particular, but also in the West Bank and even in Jerusalem. And now inside Israel, it has a military dimension, but in the political dimension, we are in a regional war. We're even in civil wars that are a result of the regional war. In other words, there are 22 million Muslims in the EU, 22 million. You think they will remain silent and accept this total destruction of Lebanon and Palestine and an attack against Iran? They will not remain silent. So I think we are in the regional war. It's not yet a classical war, but it is a war.
Thank you. Time is catching up with us here with this very interesting conversation today. My last question, I'm going to split the question and pause it to both Ambassador Freeman and to Diana because of the legal and political connotation. Today, Israel is facing some of its most serious legal challenges during its probably 7+ decade history. The cases before I'm referring to the cases before the international courts, including some of the most severe allegations of violating international law. You guys referred to some of that during your answer, such as even genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes. By blindly siding with Israel and equipping it militarily to wage this war of vengeance on Gaza, allowing for these crimes, is the U.S., Ambassador Freeman, is the U.S. essentially becoming an accessory to these crimes? Does this have a legal connotation, Diana?
Yeah, we are entirely vulnerable to being joined in a charge of genocide with Israel. We are complicit. We are responsible. We are accountable. I think it's very significant that the case was brought by South Africa, because this is essentially the former colonized world saying to the West, you have ideals which you educated us in, they inspired us, and you have betrayed them. And now it is up to us to try to enforce your own ideals. I think of, as you probably know, Khalil, I spent most of my career working with China. This is very similar to the role of Marxism in China. Marxism is a Westernizing philosophy that condemns the West for failing to live up to its own ideals. And I think that is exactly what the global majority, otherwise known as the global South, is now doing. So yes, and I don't know that that the International Criminal Court will actually be able to take the steps that it should, but I hope that there is some vestige of the rule of law left internationally, and that this will happen. Diana, I have a law degree, but I never practiced law. So, and I have a great array of lawyer jokes, which I'll spare you. But I think Diana should comment on all this.
I want to see some of the lawyer jokes because I have a few myself. I actually have a book on lawyer jokes. And you know what? They're all true on some level. So Khalil, your question is a very good one. And yes, yes, and yes. Look, it's important for people to understand that when this international legal system was formed, there's a hierarchy of laws. And this hierarchy of laws puts at the very top as genocide as being the law that nobody can violate under any circumstances whatsoever. And genocide doesn't just bind the country that is perpetrating the genocide against those that are being victimized by it, but it requires all states around the world to come together and do something to stop genocide. That's the form, and there's a few little sounds I'm hearing outside of my window right now. That's the formation of the international legal system as we know it. Now, the ICJ, when it came out with its decisions, and I want to also say that it came out with decisions before in 2004 that the United States never really paid attention to either. But on this particular case, the decisions that have come out since January of this year, all of them not only tie the hands of Israel and say to Israel what they must do, i.e., stop genocide, but it also obligates other countries as well. And it puts these countries on notice. When they say there's a plausible case for genocide, it's putting these countries on notice. The fact that we've seen more arms shipments since January come through to Israel than before, January being the first day of the first decision that came out, shows just how implicated the United States is. And so, yes, there are they are implicated in all of this. The bigger question is whether these institutions are going to continue to function or whether they're going to fall apart. Right now, if you look back, the Karim Khan came out, I believe it was on May the 20th, and said that he was planning to seek arrest warrants for Gallant and for Netanyahu, and he should be going after other individuals as well. And yet here we are in October, today is October the 10th. There's still no arrest warrants. This is the longest period of time ever in the ICC's history that we haven't seen arrest warrants, even though they said that they were going to go for it. And so we're looking at a time now where, while we have these international institutions that are so vital and so important, at the same time they're being undermined and they're being torn apart, brick by brick. And that is the fear. That is my fear. It's the fear of others as well, that this system as we know it is collapsing, all because of one very crappy country that is founded on ethnic cleansing, on ethno supremacy, and that continues to believe that it has the right to erase the native population, place it with others, and that it has the right to go in and invade other countries as well.
Thank you. As I promised, we would like to dedicate the balance of our time to questions from the audience. And we do have quite a few questions, and I'll be more than glad to read some of them and pass them on to our distinguished panelists here. And let me turn on the Q&A. All right, we do have about 14 questions, and what I would recommend is that to limit the answers a bit so that we can accommodate as many of them as possible. Diana, question for you from Ziad Bubakir. Do you think that the Oslo Accord was a mistake and basically was a recognition of the PLO by Israel at the expense of Palestinian independence?
Yeah, of course. Oh, yes. And I've written about this extensively. Look at the Oslo Accords. It's important to understand that and Leila, you'll know this better. I wasn't around during that period of time. I only got involved much later in the year 2000 on, and so Leila can probably speak to this better. But from the time that I was involved onward, yes, of course it was a mistake. And it was a mistake from my perspective because it did everything from give Israel some level of legitimacy. It gave this idea of legitimacy to carving up Palestinian land. It gave legitimacy to the idea that our rights could be negotiated. It gave, with nothing really in exchange other than, and this part is important, other than that the Palestinians were able to come home. And that is important. It is important for Palestinians to be able to return. But other than that, there was really nothing in there that was of any substantial benefit to Palestinians. Quite the contrary. It led to this idea that somehow there's a bilateral relationship, that this issue can be solved bilaterally, that negotiations are the only way, that settlement construction is fine. I mean, you name it, Oslo paved the way for all of it. And so going back to, for example, the ICJ, the last decision that just came out in July of this year, there was something that was very interesting, which was, on the one hand, we had the court that came out and said, it doesn't matter that Oslo was signed. Oslo doesn't at all serve as a cover for what Palestinian rights are. And it's up to Israel to end its occupation, to withdraw its settlers, withdraw all of them, including all the settlements completely. And so that part was very important. But what was also important was that in the submissions that countries made for this case, country after country, and particularly Western Europe and the country I was born in, Canada, as well as the United States, all hid behind this myth of Oslo and said that they believe that the only way that this issue should be addressed is through negotiations. So yes, absolutely, Oslo was a mistake. Yes, it very much paved the way for land theft, for carving up Palestinian land. for settlement activity, you name it. It did all of those things. Recognition of Israel with nothing in exchange. The why it was signed, again, was before my time.
Thank you, Diana. This next question is from Abdul Wahab Al-Qassab. I'm going to address it to Karim and to Layla also. Abdul Wahab says that we Arabs have tried everything in confronting the Zionist project in Palestine and throughout the Near East, and we know the results thus far. But now, after 1 year of this massive killing taking place in Gaza and now in Lebanon, what do you guys think is the best course of action to be followed by Arabs to attain their aims at this point? Go ahead, Karim, if you want to start. And
Well, Abdul Wahab, I'm not absolutely sure that we have tried everything. Still many approaches. We have to seize the permission to narrate, as Edward Said says, and try to penetrate the consciousness of everyone on planet Earth, whether Israelis or Americans or everyone else. The battle today is not only being fought on the ground in Gaza and in Lebanon, it is also being fought in the media on Western university campuses throughout the world. There is a lot that can be done through civic resistance, protest movements throughout the world, influence Western public opinion. Sooner or later, these countries will have to change their policies. It seems futile today. We have the impression that only force matters, but no country can resist intense domestic political pressure. We are not organized enough. We are not bringing bridges with all those who could be supportive within Western society. We still tend to view the West as a monolith. It is not a monolith. And we also have to work on, I think Layla put it very clearly when she mentioned the psychoanalytical dimension of this conflict. The Arab-Israeli conflict perhaps should be addressed not only by diplomats, politicians, economists, but also by neuroscience, by psychiatrists, psychologists. We live in a world where we are witnessing a clash of traumas. The horrendous massacres of October 7 have reawakened all the wounds. And we also have to show some understanding of Jewish suffering. We were unable as Arabs to try, if we, again, I'm quoting Edward Said, if we want them to take into consideration our suffering, we have to be able to recognize Jewish suffering and stop Holocaust denialism. Because another important thing that Layla said, she said, they are not only denying our suffering, they're also denying our very existence. This is also the famous Golda Meir quote, there's no such thing as Palestinians. We have to maintain the moral high ground by condemning all attacks on civilians, build bridges within Western public opinion, mobilize those in the global South who no longer accept that might makes right. And again, Arab civil societies also have to put pressure on their own governments, who most Arab governments have been also, in a way, complicit. As we speak, I can think of no significant Arab country that has really raised its voice and threatened to stop the normalization process, or even symbolic gestures like withdrawing ambassadors, etc. So we have our own share of responsibility, and I do not think we have exhausted our possibilities so far.
Layla, would you like to comment
Yes,
on that on the
I
Palestinian
agree.
side?
Yes, I agree totally with what Karim said, every word. And I think what we neglected most of all is talking to civil societies, whether we talk about Arabs or Europeans or Americans. We have a tendency to be a bit late in our understanding of how the world functions. The world does not only function with government institutions, the world also functions with intellectuals, artists, filmmakers, musicians, civil societies. And for example, in France, we have gained tremendous ground on local elections, local institutions, local people, and local people elected local people. We haven't reached the high circles of the Élysée and Matignon, But you can say that 80% of the population of public opinion has become very, very close with empathy towards the Palestinians. I would say the same in the US. The campuses, including in the Jewish young circles, are at the forefront of demonstrations, like the Blacks in America, the Afro-Americans, because suddenly, as if they unveiled the face of the Palestinian, and they also unveiled the hypocrisy of American politics or Western politics towards Israel. They unveiled also what Diana was calling all the lies that they say when they talk to the West. So I think we have a very big job, and I agree totally with Karim. We have not fulfilled this job entirely. We need to talk to all these civil societies, to begin with in the Arab world, and then in Europe, and then in the United States.
Thank you. Ambassador Freeman, I have a couple of questions for you, one domestic and one foreign policy oriented. The first one says, from Mark Harrison, I am told the Harris foreign policy team will be different on Israel and Gaza. What are your thoughts on her foreign policy team?
Well, there's really no evidence at all for that wishful thinking, one may hope. But I want to make a couple of comments briefly, very briefly, about what was said earlier. First, it is true that the Middle East is the place that first gave hypocrisy a bad name, but it has been perfected in the United States. And I think we need to recognize that. The Oslo Accords, I learned when I was, after the fact, asked to go to the Norwegian Foreign Ministry in Oslo, took place behind the back of the United States because the Israeli parties to that knew that if the United States were involved immediately, Dennis Ross and others would confide in Likud. So any confidentiality would be broken. It was an expediency. It was an evasion of the principal block to a settlement, which is the blank check the United States has given to Israel. That is the key that has prevented any kind of productive dialogue between Palestinians and Israelis directly. We had a glimpse of that at Oslo, but that's all it was. Finally, I think with regard to the UN and the collapse of the international system, there is nothing to stop the world's countries, if they have a consensus on something, from having an ad hoc conference and enacting rules. And if the United Nations is paralyzed, then people need to look for workarounds. But I have to say, in terms of American politics, that it's Tweedledee and Tweedledum on most issues, and this is not an exception.
Yeah. Thank you very much. A question from Zahi Khouri. Layla, maybe you can tackle this one. Considering that NATO exists, will Western Europe ever be liberated from the US and have their own foreign policy?
I don't think NATO is the problem. NATO will remain because security is a very major element in US-European relations. They still talk about the fact that they owe to the Americans the liberation of Europe and the Marshall Plan. But I don't think it's the major obstacle to a change in policy. I think the first obstacle is what we as Arabs do. I will surprise you. I think if we change our way of doing things, if our governments become a bit more democratic towards their own public opinion, if they stop putting all the journalists in prison and listen to Arab public opinion, we will weigh much more the economic aspect of what Israel is doing and what the Americans are trying to help them do, which is put their hand on all the energies, the wealth in the Arab world, is an economic fight. It's also a financial, economic attempt at deviating all this to the interest of a neo-colonial plan. It's a neo-colonial plan. In other words, we need gas and oil. They have it over there. we will support regimes that will give our companies the privilege of directing this. So young people, that's why I talk of civil society, are aware now of all this. So I think that we should start really with the Arab societies. And I love the idea. I love the idea of Ambassador Friedman that why not organize an ad hoc? Why not show some imagination and confront the realities with the initiatives? Why do we have to stay there looking at all these massacres, destruction of Lebanon, while we are talking? They just bombed the center of Beirut, Ras al Naba, which is the heart of Beirut, pretending that they are bombing a leader from Hezbollah. We are going to remain spectators of this horrible thing we are seeing in the last 13 months. We are in the 13th month. So I really believe that we are in a new world, not only the new world order, which is catastrophic because it's not an order yet, it's chaos now. But in that chaos, we have a role to play. And I would like to say that the Arab Center, that I know very well, whether in Doha or in Paris, and now I discovered the one in Washington, is doing a wonderful work in really trying to enhance, support, and in English, how do you say, vulgarize, expand the knowledge of what the Arab world is and what it can do for its own sovereignty and its future.
Thank you. That's very kind of you. We have a question from Rich Lecky with regards to the Israeli-U.S. Bilateral relationship. Why does it seem like Israel has more influence in the U.S. than the U.S. has in Israel? Is it financial leverage? Is it domestic politics? Is it geographic location? I know, Chaz, you've touched on this a little bit. Would you like to expand a little bit on that? Diana, go ahead if you want to.
It's part of a broader pattern. After the end of the Cold War, Americans judged that foreign policy was a discretionary rather than a necessary activity. You could take it or leave it. We were omnipotent, omniscient, and invulnerable. And even 9/11 didn't shake our belief in the essential triviality of foreign relations and foreign policy. So we began to apply to foreign policy the technique we had worked out politically at home, which is to take the interest group that is most interested, most intensely, and prepared to put up the most money in defense of its interests, put them in charge of making the policy and appointing the people to execute it. So the Black Caucus got Haiti, the Save the Whales movement got Norway and Japan. Everybody got China because it's a very complex place. And in West Asia, it went to the Zionist lobby. So who runs U.S. policy? It's Zionists who appoint themselves to positions. Who makes the policy? It is the Israel lobby, which is very complex. So this is part of a broader pattern. And I believe, Khalil, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, that roughly 70% of political donations to the Democratic Party come from members of the Zionist persuasion, Jews, plutocrats who gave a lot of money to that cause, and who put it first and foremost. One must take one's hat off to them for being so actively engaged in politics and being so effective in imposing their narrow view on the broader body politic. But the fact is that our politics are venal, corrupt, and open to this sort of influence on foreign policy now, because we don't believe foreign policy really counts for much. That's not important to us. Deanna, correct me.
I will correct you just a little bit. It's 70 to 80%, right? A little more.
Well, I feared that I was understating.
You're being conservative a little.
But look, I spent most of my career trying to avoid the Middle East because I knew it would complicate my life, and indeed it has. But as a result, I have worked in every region of the world. I have a degree in Latin American studies. I was the inventor of the Partnership for Peace for NATO, and a variety of other things. And I was in charge of Africa for 4 years for the United States, and I was Nixon's interpreter in '72 in Beijing, and opened the liaison office there, and so forth. And started out in India and used to speak Tamil. So I look at this, in a broader perspective. It's not as unique as you sometimes imagine. Unfortunately, it is a sad commentary on the infantile nature of American approaches to foreign policy. There's no strategy. There are attitudes. Yep. There are hopes. There are aspirations. Strategy requires you to think clearly in terms of your objectives, determine if they're feasible, and adopt and fit them to the resources available. We don't do any of that.
Thank you. Diana, did you want to add something? Otherwise, I have a new question for you.
Otherwise, that was a big wow in terms of the number. Look, I can speak to it from this angle. I'm not American, so I can't speak to it from that angle. There's been a long raging debate here among Israeli politicians about who calls the shots. Is it that Israel calls the shots, or does the United States call the shots? And in particular, since with the rise of this quite fascist right, the consensus is that we, being Israel, I'm not talking about me, but they'll say we, being Israel, are the ones who call the shots. The U.S. is going to be the payer, but not the player. And that's what they specifically say also about the European Union. So for them, it's been this long raging debate. And when Netanyahu, you could see this play itself out when Netanyahu went to Congress back in July, when he addressed Congress, where one of the things that was really very striking was he stood before Congress, in addition to the millions of rounds of applause and the 60 standing ovations or whatever it was. He said something. He said, you told me not to go into Rafah, and I went in despite that. And that was directly a message to a domestic Israeli audience saying, listen, I'm the one who's calling the shots. It's not the United States. The US can keep funding us, and they will keep funding us. And he's also said in the past that he can control Congress, that it's not such a big deal. He can control America. And so this is very much the thinking here, is that it's Israel that is doing the calling the shots, not the United States. Is it true? I think that this could be over, as Ambassador Freeman already said, very quickly. If that pipeline of that arms supply ended, it could certainly be over quickly. They certainly do have a lot of arms here. But that it would certainly wind down to a halt. The problem is I don't think that this president wants to see this genocide end. He seems to be pretty happy about it.
Fully agree with you, Diana. It could be stopped, but the choice at the top here is not to do so. They are lacking. Basically in terms of moral or political courage to take a tough decision like that. Karim, I have a question again from Ziad, basically asking, is there any way at all, in terms of international relations, to make the international community a little bit more influential, to make Israel obey international law and the United Nations resolutions?
Well, I tend to think that the so-called international community, quote unquote, is a bit like the Loch Ness monster. Everyone speaks about it, everyone has ever seen it. And the only actor that could put an end to this tragedy is the United States of America. So this is where the effort is supposed to be focused. And until this new American generation that is determined to break the statu quo reaches positions of power, I'm quite pessimistic. I have taken a look at the foreign policy team of Kamala Harris. It is true that Philip Gordon is rather more knowledgeable than some of the current persons in charge of the Middle East, but I do not think we will witness a clean break. So I'm pretty pessimistic on the short term, but 10 or 15 years from now, Israel will basically have to face reality, and reality is that the situation has become on the ground so there is such an imbrication between Arabs and Jews that the idea of establishing an apartheid system is doomed to fail. And sooner or later, Israel will have to move towards a post-Zionist system, towards democratic citizenship, because we live in an age where apartheid will no longer be accepted by an overwhelming majority of people on this planet. But again, it will take the United States using the leverage that it has.
Thank you so much. We're approaching the end of our time for this program. There are still a lot of questions from the audience to ask. I apologize for those that we couldn't get to. We hope to catch you at another program down the road. My personal thanks and gratitude to Ambassador Freeman, to Layla Shahid, to Diana Butto, and to my friend Karim Bitar for their generosity and taking time off of their busy schedule to be with us today. Your contributions were very substantive and very engaging, and I'm sure our audience enjoyed this discussion with you guys. A special thank you to Isabel and to our colleagues at CARIB for willing to join us as co-sponsor of this. Thank you very much, and greetings to all in Paris. And again, to all of those who joined us today from all over the world, we're in touch, so you stay in touch too. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you to you, Khalil.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Thank you. Thanks.